All right. So we're good? We're live now? All right. So good morning, everyone. Scanos Wigwigwam. Thank you all for joining today's session, our presentation on the history of the Cayuga Nation in Canada's annuity claim against New York State and our ongoing efforts to preserve this important collection and make it accessible both to the community and researchers. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, I'm very excited for y'all to be here today. I'm happy to share this information that we've been feels like it's been a long time, a couple of months or so researching this collection. All right, so we'll get kind of started. So, Wani, we're gonna kind of keep it kind of light here. We'll cover two things here. We'll do the preservation of the collection, and then kind of the story that kind of stemmed from it that we're able to build out of it. So this will be a little short introduction about myself. My name is Taylor Gibson. My Gohawi name is Wahadandi. Means he's on a new road or path. So I'm the senior research. I'm Turtle Clan, Cayuga Nation. I'm the senior researcher at the Oaxaca Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic. I encourage everyone to visit our center. If you can at least visit once a year, preferably more than that. But if you can only make it once a year, that's fine too. It's definitely a space for learning, connection, and a discovery of like our history and past. So one day I'll be discussing two key areas. So our research on the preservation efforts, piecing together the story from these historical documents. All right. So a good question that we have is, where are the records? So a majority of our records, any type of interaction with the government, is housed at Library and Archives Canada. So at that time, it'd be like the Dominion Archives, but it's a repository for all the federal documents. So think about like Indian Affairs, for example. Any type of correspondence they had with the Indian agents down here in connection with our community, Six Nations community, all those records would end with the the Indian agent, and then to the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And so all those records would be housed at Library and Archives Canada. Fortunately, I was an archivist there. I want to say about 2017-ish. 2017 to 2021, I worked as an archivist at Library Archives Canada. And with that experience, I had time and I was shown like how to navigate like their system and like their collection system. So online, so you can actually access this material yourself online, but it's how it's organized, it's really difficult to manage because they digitize in big, huge batches. So some things you're looking at maybe about 400 pages in a batch there. So it's very tricky. And so one of the things I learned, like as I had time and training to go through the collection, I was able to see like make note of some of the things that I wanted to research at some point in the future. And one of them was this Cayuga claim, this Cayuga annuity claim against New York. And that goes all the way back to when, my own personal experience, as well as like being a child and, coming, not really understanding why we get $5 annuity, right around like bread and cheese. So like just the sweet care. So as a child, I don't really understand that. You just know you get the Kika money, and that money's spent before you get before you leave the fair or anything like that. And so you don't really think much of it as you're growing up, right? And then as you get into these positions and you start learning more and start having that opportunity to learn, definitely going to take it. So some of the things that are housed at Library and Archives Canada, they have petitions, correspondent letters, memorandums, briefs, telegrams, correspondent letters, I think I said again, newspaper clippings, treaties, maps, medals, etc. There's tons of information they have there. And again, this will be only one side of one part of that story there. And I want to say too, like, so a lot of our collection, like the collection that we have too, isn't just primarily at Library and Archives Canada, although a big bulk of it is. Not everything is there, so we're able to find some material from the Manitoba archives, the Smithsonian archives as well too. So we're fortunate enough to find material in other places. However, this housed the bulk of that information. It was really helpful for understanding it. All right, so starting our research. So like how do we come about doing this? So like I mentioned, like our earliest memories, myself as a researcher, and I'm really thankful for like Stanley or Bobby Henry, like he was our acting director at the time. And so he was really interested in this story as well too. And so he provided us support and encouragement to go further and do the research for this. So very thankful to him as well. And so, and he's also Gaiacono too, so that was really helpful so that we could share like our memories about like, getting this $5 and what does it mean and kind of talking about where does this history come from? Why do we get this $5? Why is the Cayuga Nation the only one? And then so that's earliest memory, but also community experience. So if you collect annuity, you probably have your own memories as well too, right? And I'd be curious to know what your parents or your grandparents or your aunts and uncles used to say about it back then too. And then the other thing too, that I'm wondering is questioning, where does the annuity come from? Is it different from other annuity payments in Canada? And the answer is yes, it is very different. So like the number of treaties and the Huron-Robinson treaties and all the other treaties, that it's usually made with like the First Nations and your Métis groups directly with the federal government or the Canadian government. In this instance, it was not the case. This is a relationship between New York State and the Cayuga Nation. The federal government is just holding the money pretty much, but we'll get to that. That's kind of the end. All right, so again, so that's so kind of understanding that portion of it. It's not the same kind of annuity, although Cayuga Nation and a lot of Anishinaabe nations do get annuity in Canada, but the Cayuga Nation is very separate. And then, as I mentioned, Library and Archives Canada is a federal repository of documents. So we really lucked out. A lot of the documents were already digitized, and so that we're able to just go in and just download and print. It was a lot to go through. So the records, it was digitized underneath our Records Group 10 series. So that's what all First Nations groups in the Library and Archives Canada will be grouped as RG10 records. And so that's again, that's only I know that through working through Library and Archives Canada. So the red series is east of Manitoba, Ontario border, and the black series is west of the border. So these contain files, letters, correspondence from both headquarters and field offices. Very good information to find there. And I'll just show you like a brief summary of so what we started doing was printing off all the documents that we could find, and some of them would be in huge batches. So that meant going through 400 pages in one sitting. And then reading through each document to see which one matches and then trying to arrange it in the right dates. And having like the space was really important, but also like being able to print it off, but also filing, having all the resources there to organize the material and arrange the material was extremely important. And so when you come to the center, you'll be able to access a lot of what we have here. So preservation of the collection. Our work includes printing, reviewing the files, arranging them into accessible, I guess, files. But that should be reviewing the documents and arranging them to accessible files. Sorry. So that's been the ongoing work. And then to top it off, we're also doing a creation of the finding aid. And this is to make the material more accessible. So we're not quite done yet, but we're still plowing along here. We have over 260 entries so far. And keep in mind, each entry isn't just like maybe like 3 or 4 different letters in there, right? So not everything has this 1 or 2 in there, but maybe 3 or 4 in there. So the number is probably actually much higher, but we try and group them together so you can understand and keep like the theme that they're mentioning about together. There's names of community members that span from 1792 to 1990s. Well, I would even say dare say the present time too, because we have newspapers from 2000. So there's a lot of community history. So the finding aid will allow for much easier searching, and also we're doing painstaking work of summarizing each of the documents too, so that you can read a summary. So if it catches your interest, you want to read it, that information is there for you. So that's what's also taking a bit of time too, is like summarizing each of the document and compiling all that information together. So it's been really exciting doing that work because I get to read everything too. And then the collection can be thought of 2 parts. So that's when I was able to break down 2 parts. So we have 2 boxes so far. So we have the history of the annuity claim. So that stems from 1792 to 1927, which is the Privy Council announcement of the Cayuga Award. And then part 2 is the history of distribution of payments, so 1929 to present. So the first payments happened in 1929. However, today we're only going to be talking about the history of the annuity claim because it's very intense and also a lot to talk about. So we'll kind of just cover the story today as well. And then perhaps like a part 2, we'll cover the distribution of payments. However, that is an interesting story. And I'm also finding a lot more community member names in there too. So a lot of good stuff in that one. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can come up with that. All right, so let's kind of get into it. Oh yeah, so this is the last little bit about the collection and what it includes. So it includes government correspondent letters, a treaty, a medal, a map, petitions, memorandums, newspaper clippings, photographs, and ethnographical field notes. So it's a good collection. You'll definitely pick up something in there. But why is it important? Well, there's a lot. It's a huge connection to Six Nations history. So not only is it Cayuga Nation history, but it's also adds another element to the Six Nations history. And because a lot of it stems from like the migration over from migration from New York State to Grand River. So that history is very important and exciting for me too, because there's not very much history that talks about the actual migration or moving over. So with this history, it allows us to cover that time period, right? So from Cayuga Lake to Grand River, it also helps understanding our history as Ongohoe people, our Ongohoe. And it allows learners and students to learn from history from 1789 to present times. So it gives you this window into time that's really interesting, and you can pick up information, you can pick up why we get this claim, but also what was happening to our people throughout that time period. And it's also necessary for understanding where the annuity originates from. Because I find like a lot of times, like it kind of irks me a little bit when people say, oh, it's $5, but it's like, oh, if you only knew how hard people struggled to get this and what it meant for the people at the time. Some people never seen the fruits of their labor. Well, as we get into the story, you'll see, some people, they started as early 1809 and then they pass away. They don't ever see it, and it doesn't get resolved in 1927. So it goes through a couple lifetimes before it gets there, a couple generations. All right. So we'll get to the story. We'll just get right into the story. I think that'll be the most exciting thing. So, what did we come up with all these documents? So the story of the Cayuga Nation, Canada, their annuity claim against New York State. So I wanted to show this map here because it's so from Cayuga Lake to Grand River. So this map by Sir Guy Johnson, 1771, shows the Six Nations before the American Revolution, kind of where the story kind of begins. So as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but right along here is Cayuga Lake. So it's mentioned with the Cayugas. So they make their way down to Niagara through here. But some other things that are important to know is chief titles like Cayuga Nation, because it does come up later on when they're signing petitions. So yeah, you can see that they're actually condoled in hereditary chiefs. So that's also very important. So I want to share this with you as well too. But where I got the names from, one of them comes from Concerning the League by John Arthur Gibson, and the others from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy website. And those are important because they'll tell you like, so Haga Annual is a very important one, and Gajino Ndawasa was also two very important titles there. And the interesting thing about this collection too is that we learned a little bit about this other chief title, Sayonways. He has long Mapom, he has long intestine, but we'll get to that in a second. All right, so where does this annuity come from? So on February 25th, 1789 and July 27th, 1795, the Cayuga Nation and the state of New York entered into treaties. These treaties ceded all but 2 square miles of land and a tract for the chief fish carrier Ohojigete in exchange for a perpetual annuity. The Cayuga Nation ceded about 3-mile wide strip from Lake Ontario to Pennsylvania. Following the 1789 session, many Cayugas relocated to Grand River in 1795. Another group moved to Ohio. Oh, and the other thing too to keep in mind, so with this treaty here, this is the actual treaty from 1795 that was given to fish carrier. And it was really odd at that time because a lot of duplicate copies of treaties weren't really given to chiefs at the time. But this one was given to the fish carrier, which in turn brought it over to Grand River because his family was there, but also he knew his title would eventually return back there. So he brought the Grand River, and that's a really interesting story because he ends up leaving it with this other leading figure named Chief Joseph Montour, but we'll get to him in a second. Another thing that was kind of given to him too is the George Washington Peace Medal of 1792. Oh, did I get back to that? Oh, okay, we're good. We're good. Sorry. And so another one that was given to fish carrier is 1792. And to keep in mind, this is really similar to the one that was given to what's his name? Red Jacket. So there's a 1792 one by Red Jacket as well. So the story or the local lore around this is it was presented to the chief fish carrier by George Clinton in 1792 at Cayuga Lake or Buffalo Creek. One was also likewise presented to Red Jacket. But the local lore of it is that it was actually hung on the neck by George Washington himself. But that's just like, it couldn't be substantiated. It was just like oral tradition or oral part of the story. So it wasn't really clear on that. But I think it was probably George Clinton in 1792. Yeah. So the medal is a symbol of peace and friendship. And roughly 9 years after it was given roughly 9 years after American Revolution and Independence. So the other thing to keep in mind too, right? 1779, there was the Clinton-Sullivan campaign that happened to our people as well too. It cleared out a lot of the villages and made our people directly dependent on British resources and foods. So because our food sovereignty got wiped out, so a lot of times people probably didn't feel like returning home after all that stuff, especially in time dealing with Americans. So one of the leading figures that kind of come from this is this Ojigite, or this fish carrier. And so he's the head chief that is the signature on the 1789 and 1795 Cayuga Ferry treaties. And he was also one that was given tract of land in New York. But the other thing that was really interesting about him too, he's actually one of the chiefs that signed the original Treaty of Canandaigua in 1794. So I don't know if you can actually see it, but he's listed like right there. And you can, it's very faint, but you can see the fish carrier. The other thing that we found out too that was really interesting was his name appears on the power of attorney to Joseph Brant and John Norton in 1806 by the Grand River Chiefs, which is on the bottom there. And also we learned from this history that the Cayuga migration splintered into 3 different groups of Cayugas. So who is the Cayuga Nation after the American Revolution? So after the American Revolution, the Cayuga Nation split into 3 groups that I mentioned. So there's the one that stayed in New York, so Cattaraugus Cayugas. There's the Oklahoma Cayugas who went out west, and then the Grand River Cayugas, which is the largest body of Cayugas, went to Canada. Just want to make sure I got everything on there. All right, so let's get on to the next one. So here's a little interesting piece here. So I know we use this map a lot, but this map is extremely helpful. So this map is by Reverend Robert Lugger. It shows the Cayuga settlements. Well, it shows all the 6 nations, but for our purposes, it shows the two major Cayuga settlements. Well, I guess you can arguably say 3 Cayuga settlements here. So on the bottom here, we have the lower Cayugas, which would settle around here. And then we have the upper Cayugas in 2 groups. So one's kind of settled near Brantford, what I guess today we call like Two Little Heights with the Tulas. And then the other one with some Oneidas. And eventually they get relocated to Silver Springs. But I got some more information for you. So in 1850, Lewis Henry Morgan traveled to Grand River, met with Peter Fish Carrier, the son of the original fish carrier, and Chief John Jacobs. So here's what he had to say about it. So Peter Fish Carrier, the son of Hojigite, or Fish Carrier, the celebrated Cayuga sachem who resided at Ganoga, is now about 60 or 70 years old. He is a fine-looking, intelligent, sociable. We had a pleasant time with him. At the time of Sullivan's invasion in 1779, his father removed with the Cayugas to Niagara. So it's a little about John J. So that's it. That's the son of the original fish carrier who signed it, right? So his name is Peter Fish Carrier. And Peter Fish Carrier was also present during the surrender of Six Nations Reserve in 1841 as well, or 1843, I should say. Another fellow that was mentioned here is Chief John Jacobs, or Jotawego. Jacobs was by far the finest looking man we saw on the reservation. He is a Cayuga sachem, 70 or 80 years old, very pleasant and sociable. Since he is a pagan in his customs and habits. When we saw him last, he was on his way to attend the false faith dance. We obtained from him names of tribes of the Cayuga, Oneida, and Mohawk sachems, which was given on another paper. He says the Oneidas and Mohawks never had but 3 tribes. We bought off him and curiously carved cane and the best new burn strap. But the wildest thing that he mentions in there too was that he can still remember like the Cayuga village that he was born from, and he walked over. As a kid, he walked over from Cayuga Lake to Grand River, and there a lot of them were born around this place called White Man's Creek near Buffalo. That's where Buffalo, Brantford. Sorry, that's where a lot of them had settled. It's a very interesting history right there. And another history that we learned from in 1914 in this ethnographic field note by Alexander Goldenweiser, History of the Grand River Reserve. So he talks about the Cayugas. So he talks about the whole reserve, but the Cayugas originate from Cayuga Lake. So Cayugas came from Cayuga Lake after the Revolution, settled in 3 places: Cattaraugus, Oklahoma, and Canada. Of the Canadian Cayugas, moves stopped at places now called Cayuga. Others joined the Tulalore, who had come 3 years previous near Brantford, Eagle's Nest, built a longhouse where the land on the other side of the river was surrendered to Cayuga tribe, excluding a few families, moved to the township of Oneida. Grand Road, or Old Plank Road, built a longhouse. It ran about 20 years. About 1841, surrendered this also and moved inside the boundary line, or Haldimand County, Cayuga, and built a longhouse. At present, the lands of Cayuga and Tule were surrendered. The Upper Cayuga moved to Sour Springs, built a longhouse first on the other side of Mackenzie Creek, and about 1875 moved the longhouse this side of the creek, where its present state, where Sour Springs Longhouse is today. And that's so funny because when they tore down that longhouse, there was that I'm pretty sure that's what the year was marked on some of those logs on it. It was 1875, and it was like, why was that date on there? Well, that kind of explains that history there. So it's really neat when you find these little things like that, and we can see like how that map is helpful in understanding where we were at different times. So this 1828, you can kind of get an idea of where people were living. All right, so another thing too that we get that's interesting is the census records. So of course, like for our purposes, we're looking at the Cayuga Nation, but as a whole, like, and this is kind of like something that happens with the rest of the research as well too, is that it's not just Cayugas, but also the rest of the nation. So we're finding other information. So in 1795, we see a census of all the folks that were at Grand River who were getting annuity disbursements. And so we can kind of see their numbers there as well too. But the thing that we can pull out of there, of course, is the Upper Cayugas, and then the Montour family, group of Cayugas, which are separated, and then the Lower Cayugas as well. All right, so we know up until like so from 1795 up until 1807, annuities were going fine. Like they were getting paid. They would eventually they would travel through to Fort Erie to collect their annuities, everything like that. So, and I should say 1809. Sorry, not 1808. Sorry for the typo there, but 1809 is when the annuities actually stopped coming for the Cayugas on the Canadian side, and there wasn't really a reason why. It never really was like I never really kind of explained further why it was stopped or anything like that. Um, but the big reason why it did stop it, or why it was claimed anyway, was due to the outbreak of the War of 1812. However, records show that it actually stopped previously to that, but um, that's just what people have argued since then. It's just that it stopped because of this war. However, but there was a certain provision that was put in Article 9 of the Treaty of Ghent. So what stopped the War of 1812 is the Treaty of Ghent 1814. And so we have the Pledge of the Crown Wampum. But however, there was an article put in there in the actual original Treaty of Ghent, Article 9, that was talks about restoration of rights. Article 9 restored the pre-war rights of Ongohoe nations with colonial governments. However, the Cayuga annuity was still not reinstated. And then the US did not fulfill its obligations under Article 9. But keep in mind too, Canada is also supposed to be making peace with the American Ongohoe on American side as well too. I often think about that, especially when we're talking about like the Jade Treaty, for example, and how we can get over on that side and go work in the United States, but folks in the United States or some of our relatives in the States can't come over to Canada, partake in anything like that. But there may be a case to fight it there. That's what I would say. That's what I would point to anyway. Has Canada, restored any of the rights of the Ongohoe people on the American side? Anyway, so this was this will be a larger piece of the argument that is made on the Cayuga behalf as well too. I just want to put that out there. All right. So, however, the United States refused on the grounds that Cayuga Nation and Canada had fought against the United States during the War of 1812, therefore forfeit their annuity. So they weren't going to recognize it. And so this is where our story gets kind of interesting as well, too. So this is Dr. Peter Wilson. He's a Cattaraugus Cayuga. He's one of the head chiefs of that time. He's actually a medical doctor. He's one of the very few medical doctors that time, Omaha medical doctors, I should say. So it's a photo taken, a daguerreotype photo of him taken in 1850. And so he actually acted as a state interpreter. He has the other name too, Deji Nonda Weho. I'm pretty sure that is a title, but that's the one that he was holding as well too. Um, however, he was kind of controversial to the Cayuga claim. Um, he states that the Cayugas in Canada have, so he actually wrote a couple of letters to the New York governor in 1843. He states the Cayugas in Canada have no claim to the annuity, emphasizes that the non-immigrating Cayugas, those who remained in the U.S., are rightful recipients. Notes that Cattaraugus Cayugas could not immigrate without breaking up families. Also includes, he also had a really significant speech in 1843, but it was really just affirming that only those who residing in the U.S. soil should receive the annuities. And it kind of comes to like a huge big thing where it's like they challenge his claim in a later, they challenge all the evidence in his speech there, but he's never able to prove anything. And so we have copies of that speech as well too. It's very fascinating to read. One of the big rumors that kind of stem from it is an agreement between nations to only partake in annuities residing in their what is it? An agreement between nations to only partake, so between Omaha nations on American Canadian side, to only partake on the annuities that the land they reside in. So if you're in Canada, you're not going to take it on the American side, or if you're in America, you're not taking it on the Canadian side. That was reported in the speech, but it was never really confirmed with anybody else. Not even with the Cayugas and Senecas on the American side either. So they couldn't really confirm anything in his speech. So it was very controversial. It was so controversial, in fact, the Cayuga chiefs down at Grand River, so Chief John Joseph Montour, who was delegated to go handle the business, and John Jacobs, who we mentioned from the Morgan papers there. So they signed this petition in 1848, and one of their complaints was that they weren't used well. Some of them were saying that the misinterpretation by Wilson, hurt their case, and so a lot of it was complaining about that in there. All right, so and then so some other things to add as well too. Sorry. So the petition, I just want to talk a little bit more about that. So the petition, they expressed the dissatisfaction with Dr. Peter Wilson's representation and requested the matter to be formally addressed by the state. So in 1849, the claim was referred to New York Lands Commission. I think that's the next slide I have here. So yes, legal matters. Oh wait, we can go back here for a second. And so the commission found that petition and treaty valid, but no action was taken. A big thing was that they didn't have like the authority to do so. And the other thing was that the Cayuga Nation residing in Canada did not abrogate their rights in the treaty or in the war because it was viewed as a private contract and not an actual treaty. So that's what kind of saved them at this point. It was unaffected by the war. And that was so the story goes a little bit further interesting too. So in 1857, right, there was a council held at the Cayuga Longhouse. So the chiefs and principal men of the upper and lower Cayugas met and sent a deputation to Toronto to meet with Penfeather. He was the superintendent agent at the time. And representatives included Commander Morgan, Joseph Montour, Jacob Jameson, and John Hinlock. And then from 1883 to 1880, oh wait, I'm jumping ahead there. So again, it didn't really get passed or anything like that. And so they have like a lot of, I would say, like unsuccessful attempts with legal matters. Because after that, they take it to, I want to say, All right, so sorry, the 1848, 1849, the claim was revived and petitioned to the New York legislature. That's where it failed in, sorry. Or it got recognized, sorry, but then like it didn't get acted upon. All right, so and then what's next? Okay, so as we move along, again, so yeah, then it doesn't really go anywhere until we get to the Bissel Commission, but I'll get to that in a second. So New York State Legislature in 1884, the claim was revived in the New York State Board of Audit and dismissed due to jurisdictional issues. General James Clark Strong, which was the chief's lawyer at the time, appealed to New York Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the Cayugas in March 1885. The court appeal ruled later that the state was not proper party to enforce the treaty. So from 1887 to 1888, General Strong lobbied for a single commissioner to negotiate a settlement. And so this is what he was able to get here. So this is the act that he was able to get put through. However, the two bills that he tried to introduce did not pass, and the American Civil War delayed further action. So again, that's from 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War, delayed their efforts, and so is about 1888, 89. The Bissel Commission is established to investigate and determine the rightful payees of the Cayuga Annuity. And it gets really interesting in there. That commission, I'll get to that in a second. But General James C. Strong successfully advocated the creation of a one-person commission. This marked a significant step to formalizing the claim and documenting evidence from the Canadian Cayugas. So that's James Clark Strong right here. So that's a very interesting history. And that's actually, he talks about the Bissell Commission there and talks about the importance of all the next steps that he took. So this report is by him. And one of the things that's really interesting is like, how did the chiefs find this fellow? But the other thing that he was working with is Seneca claim. So he was working with like a lot of Haudenosaunee claims in the United States. All right. And then so 1889, there's 1888 to 1889 is the Herbert Bissell Commission. And this is a really fascinating one. So it's, like I said, it established to determine the rightful payees, but it goes into like determining who are the Cayugas, who is the Cayuga Nation at this time. And one of their star witnesses is this William Henry Fish Carrier, a nephew of the original fish carrier. So very fascinating. I'll get into his history in a second. And it's a huge trial. It has witnesses, and then it goes from New York Cayugas, Oklahoma Cayugas, Grand River Cayugas. And it determined that the Cayugas residing in Canada were entitled to annuity. However, the decision was overruled in the appeals court. Again, so it never gets taken up any further than that and kind of gets left alone. However, though, this the level of body of like the abundance of information that are in this commission is worth investigating further. There's tons of information there. For example, William Henry Fish Carrier, which is present in the photo from the Manitoba archives. This was taken by Edmund Morris in 1809 or 1807, which he passed away in 1809. So he was around for much longer after that photo. But he was a star witness in this trial. And he gives the whole account of like Six Nations history or Cayuga history from what he could remember. The other thing to keep in mind too, not a lot of them can speak English. Actually, pretty well none of them can speak English, and all of them are speaking through an interpreter. So they have a Cayuga interpreter there. It's John Stigers, and so he's acting as the interpreter. So the whole thing is in the language, but because it's a stenograph, it's typed, it's all in English, right? They just typed out the translation, but to know that it was all done in the language was really neat. And just to be a fly on that wall would have been really fascinating. But he talks about the history of the Cayugas and Six Nations and kind of where they come from, and the origins of the chief titles, the laws and customs. And there's a lot of little like snappy remarks in there too that are pretty funny. Like it's actually worth reading. It's a huge body of documents. So that in itself is a lot to read in there, but there's a lot of names in there. It goes through like they ask the questions that you wish you could ask back in those times, So it's very fascinating. They do cross-examination. So once they provide a story, they re-ask them some of the questions in there. So again, it's very, very fascinating. Like I would really recommend reading the Bissell Commission because it has like tons of information about like our chief titles, but also different names and histories in there. And that was well documented too. Like the hearings were like, they were reported by New York Times. Newspapers were very fascinated with this subject. And the other thing to keep in mind too, it was the testimony took place. They gathered witnesses in Brantford, they gathered witnesses in Toronto, they gathered witnesses in Buffalo. And they all like it is a very fascinating piece of document. And I got another photo for you as well too. I should ask that his maternal uncle was Peter Fishcarrier as well. And that's where the other thing that they kind of go into that commission, I should say too, is that it turns out that Chief George Joseph Montour, who had a title, he originally so they didn't speak English, right? And they had this. He was given possession of that thing by fish carrier, and he was selling on his fireplace for the longest time. They had this non-native person come by, I guess, and for that reason, he was reading the history. He read this treaty from it. It turned out like there were all annuities and stuff, and it was like a whole big thing for them. And they didn't even realize it was just sitting on a fireplace, that treaty. And the other thing that ties into it is the medal. So the other thing was when he was a young boy, his grandmother gave him that medal to go take it to the silversmith to go melt down to make spoons. But it turned out the silversmith wasn't there that day, and so he just came, brought it home, and he gave it to his mother or his grandmother, and she just gave it to him so he can just have that. And so that's why that medal still exists to this day. Is because the silversmith was closed, and that's why we have it to this day. And even the treaty itself too, it's very fascinating. And of course, like these items, I want to put a thread in that because we have to come back to those items a little bit later. But there were key elements to this commission as well too, because it pretty much proved the Cayuga story that we went to Grand River. Because we know that as common history today, but they had to actually prove that in a court of law, which some of you may know, it's very difficult. So they actually had to prove it. And we found in Service Commission that there was no Cayuga history written by a Cayuga person up until that point in time. So that oral history that they give is our history. It is written history at that time. And so they had to acknowledge oral history because there was no written history. And one of the sources that they grabbed out of there was Lewis Henry Morgan's book. Because it talks about the Cayugas in there. Like, it has those field notes from 1850 when he came to Grand River. So again, that's how all that stuff kind of ties together. It's pretty fascinating. So this picture here is the Cayuga chiefs in 1901, who are all featured in the commission. So we got pictures of them. And as you can tell, you can see William Henry Fishcarrier right here, present here as well too. William Wedge. So we have some, and the crazy thing is we have a lot of the chiefs have been photographed. We have some from the early 1800s, or sorry, mid 1800s. And yeah, it's just fascinating to see like how you can see them when they're young as they get older. But this would be like their lifetime. They would, fight this case. This is just one issue they had amongst other things, right? So as I mentioned, it was really reported in the newspaper clippings. And I just wanted to share one with you. But it highlights from the commission. So some of the things in there that it kind of highlights is like some bombshells. So there was a whole controversy about defrauding the Cayugas in Grand River. So apparently there was this, I'm not going to say names, but this paper, you want to read it, you can read it for yourself. I titled it like the defraud controversy. So the fraud controversy is, so a local fellow from here was offered by the Cayugas in New York to say that they made some kind of agreement here and that they agreed not to take partake in any of the annuities of the Cayugas in New York or whatever. And so that was what this guy was going to say, and they offered him 9,000, and he'd come live with them in New York, and he'd get a share of the annuity. And so he tries to recruit this other guy, but it turns out they try to do it in broad daylight for whatever reason. And some people so there's witnesses in there, so they call these people up to go testify and said, yes, I heard this person say this, this, and this. And so it turned out like it was a huge bombshell for the Cayuga Nation in New York, their case, because it pretty much well showed that they don't really have much to stand on there. And another thing that happened too was that there was a letter that was produced by William Henry that was given by this name, as Cayuga Chief Daniel Winnie. And then they come short, he gives the history of the Oklahoma Cayugas. And he said this Cayuga Chief Shohiomas, long guts are intestines, remember the Cayuga Chief title I mentioned before? He's the one that brought him out to Ohio and where the Oklahoma, the Seneca Cayuga Oklahoma tribe. That's who brought him out there, was that Cayuga Chief Shohiomas. So again, like that little type of history, like the little piece of information, just adds to our history there, and like it fills in that little gap and how they got out there. All right. So what did the and so that was the claim they found out. Another big bombshell was that the Cayuga claim, or sorry, the letter by Daniel Winnie, talking about like joining forces and things like that, and the mutual support. It was a very good positive letter, but it also showed like we're different from those ones. And then different one, another thing too was to show that our treaty, like we actually had the possession of the treaty at Grand River, showed that we were actually Cayugas. And then the other thing too was that they argued that a lot of the people that spoke the language and customs in Grand River, or spoke the Cayuga language and practiced the ceremonies, were still at Grand River. They said it wasn't so much so at in New York or Oklahoma. So the core customs and beliefs and language and culture of the Cayuga Nation was sitting at Grand River. So what did the Bissel Commission find? So the Mission Commission of 1888-89 was sympathetic to the Canadian Cayuga's claim. The commission acknowledged that the Canadian Cayugas were part of the original Cayuga Nation that had entered into the treaties with New York State in 1789 and 1795. These treaties promised a perpetual annuity in exchange for land cessions. The commission recognized their moral and historical right to share the annuity, especially since they had been excluded from payments in 1809. So the Cayuga Nation in New York and Ohio continued to make the treaties and continued to treat the U.S. And this goes from 1809 to 1830s. And so they pretty much, there's no annuities anymore after that for them. However, our people weren't privy to any, the Cayuga Nation in Canada weren't privy to anything beyond 1809. So, okay, great. Good news, right? We have our ruling. However, however, so what happened legally? So despite the commission's rulings, the New York State Attorney General and the Board of Claims rejected this claim. So in 1885 case, the 1885 case I mentioned, the portion of the Cayuga Indians residing in Canada versus the state of New York Court of Appeals ruled that Canadian Cayugas had no legal standing to sue under this treaties because they were no longer residents of New York. So in short, yes, the Bissel Commission did affirm the right in principle, but the legal system ultimately denied their compensation. So this brings us to another matter. But yes, I just want to stay here for a second and just tell you, like, the oral tradition here alone is extremely important. And I would really recommend that we all read that commission report because there's a lot of good history in there. And there's names, there's tons of names in there too. There's men's names, women's names. Because of like the controversy, there's a lot of character witnesses that were brought in, and it's a good story, that probably doesn't need to be written up. All right, so let's keep moving along. So this is kind of where we learned that there's some issues here. So it never gets acted upon, and it kind of just drops dead. And then the other thing too is that General James Clark, the last correspondence that we hear from is about 1896, and then he kind of just stops after that. So don't really hear too much afterwards. That's kind of his last hurrah, I guess, that he's trying to fight this claim, because he keeps trying to fight the claim, but 1896 is kind of the last of it there from what we see from him. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that he had an agreement with the Cayuga Nation to a certain percentage of their claim if they had won. Because keep in mind, like, the claim itself was roughly about 400,000 at the time, and they had to drop it because that was with interest. So they dropped it at the time because it was like they weren't going to get anywhere with that. So it kind of comes down to like arbitration. So there's a few things that kind of lead up to like leading to this arbitration. From the letters that we see from the Indian agent, especially council minutes, we see divisions between the upper and lower Cayugas. And so there's so the lower Cayugas, they want to I should capitalize lower, sorry about that. But the lower Cayugas were in favor of dealing directly with Washington. So collecting money and sending delegates directly to Washington to deal with this. The upper Cayugas were looking to deal directly through arbitration. And so I think I have so the arbitration is a legal method to resolve disputes outside of court where a neutral arbiter makes a binding decision on both sides. But it's roughly about 1902, and there's letters and dispatches from the Canadian government where the Indian superintendent is updating him on the Cayuga claim, gives updates on the Cayuga claim, suggesting that it might be better to secure settlement through arbitration. And they requested that Cayuga Nation be informed of this possibility. So the upper and lower Cayuga chiefs initially disagreed. Lower Cayugas preferred direct negotiation with Washington. Uppers supported arbitration. And on April 2nd, 1902, a consensus was reached at the Oswego Council House to proceed with arbitration. Because they found that it's the U.S. state money, and so the federal government won't have any type of say over state money. So again, that's more about their legal system. So that's just going to end, and it's going to be fruitless. Pretty much is what the government was saying. So arbitration was pretty well their only recourse after this, because they weren't acting on it. So the original arbitration was scheduled for 1914, but because of World War I, it was World War I postponed it. So keep in mind, the American Civil War postponed it, and the First World War postponed it as well now. And it got really interesting here too, with the Chief Isaac Davis. So in 1895, he was given power of attorney over the treaty document and the treaty medal. So those were two items that were very significant for that case. And so he was kind of given the power of attorney over these two items to keep it going forward and pressing this matter. And it becomes this is another one you got to put your thread in, because it becomes an issue later on. So new movement by New York. So arbitration is recommended. The Pecuniary Claims Court is mentioned, and the Cayugas. Okay, so yes, Cayugas will attempt to withdraw it, and then Cayuga identity in Canada, treaty medal controversy. So the Chief Isaac Davis and the treaty medal controversy are directly tied together, because they had to get ready for this arbitration case in the Pecuniary Claims Court. But we're trying to get all the documentation together, and I think are we jumping ahead here? So this document here, so they were trying to prepare for this claims court, and one of the things that's really beautiful and that we have is that so they prepared a list of annuity history of the Six Nations. Not like some of it, like a lot of it specific for Cayuga, but just a lot of it for Six Nations in general. So even if you're not Cayuga, you'll find something interesting in there. A lot of history tied to our annuities. And then that stems another area of research for us is Six Nations annuity history, because it ties into that, because they did all this research to cover for this claims court, and they did all the work for us. We just have to piece it together and see what they got from it. But we can see the chiefs' names on there. You see Robert Davy, Joseph Henry, Jacob General, Abram Charles, David General. So this thing here, they authorized E.D. Cameron to give the authority to the visiting superintendent of Six Nations to act on their behalf, to request the parchment back from Chief Isaac Davis, because he wasn't giving that treaty back. So that's the other thing too. People were looking for this treaty and the documents that were tied to it, and he didn't give anything back. So they actually requested it several times, and he didn't give it back. And he ends up eventually dying in 1902, I believe, or 1903. And there's a big race now. Where is it? What happened to these treaty and documents? And so the government is involved now, and they're actually searching for this document. And they believe that the heir of Chief Isaac Davis has these documents. And it's an interesting little race against time to find this, because they're getting preparation for this claims. And keep in mind, the federal government cannot act on this time, and they mentioned that too, that they can't act on this until they have full consent of the Cayuga Nation. All right, so, and then another thing too. In 1924, tensions between Six Nations and the Dominion government over sovereignty further delayed this process. Let's see if I get. So so the other thing that's really exciting about this collection is Chief Deskai, Levi General, in 1923 actually comments on here. And he actually wrote to the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs from Geneva requesting clarity on whether the funds would be returned to the imperial government or paid directly to the Cayuga Nation, the Dominion government's role in dispersing the funds, whether the Cayuga Nation would have access to funds if the Dominion refused. And then the Dominion office had allegedly misused Six Nations funds. He had commented about that. And then this guy questioned the lack of transparency and accountability. He warned that if the funds would be turned over to the Canadian government, it would be unpleasant duty to inform the Cayuga Nation of this misappropriation. As a response, the Secretary of State advised this guy to address the matter with the Canadian government. This guy rejected this response, asserting that the Dominion was not party to the original treaty and had no rightful claim to the funds. And it's very accurate on that. So Judge Newcomb informed Scott of a dispatch received from Chief Deskai, Levi General, regarding the Cayuga claim. He references the history of the claim, knowing that it was originally scheduled to be heard in 1914, but was delayed due to the outbreak of World War I. Newcomb suggests that it is not improbable that tribunal may reconvene and leaves the decision on how to respond up to Scott. And so as they're bracing, so that's the little background behind that too. So there's a lot of tensions around it. And so eventually they do go forward with it. And so the original claim is around $247,609 without interest. That's originally what they were trying to get at that time. And it doesn't really restart until 1926 with the Pecuniary Claims Court for Arbitration Tribunal, which is this document featured here. We have that in a collection too, if you want to read that for yourself. I don't have the full details on that, but I can tell you how much we got because I'm looking at the time, we're kind of running out. Yes. We have this one, you can read the full for yourself as well. However, it wasn't without controversy. So the Pecuniary Claims Court for Arbitration began October 19th, 1925. The Cayuga chiefs, led by Alex General Tanadones, attempted to withdraw from the arbitration under American and British Claims Convention. So they did try to attend this, so he was given the provisions because they felt that the money wasn't going to come to them. They felt the Canadian government was going to hold on to this money and then just do whatever they wanted with it. So they did try to withdraw, but the Claims Tribunal did not allow for the withdrawal because they didn't recognize the Cayuga Nation. They only recognized that the Cayuga Nation at this time they weren't internationally recognized, but they were sponsored by Great Britain. So Great Britain was the actual claimant that could actually withdraw from it, and so they didn't. They actually went forward with it. The court case itself was positive for the Cayugas or the Canadian government at that time, I guess, if you will. It was positive for them because they pretty much laid out a really good, strong case against the Americans. And it was actually, I was just speaking with Bobby about this, it's actually really continued studied in international law today. Like it's still really well studied because it had a whole bunch of other matters too that are kind of tied into it, like historical matters. And it's funny that ours kind of ended up in the same space as well too. So it's very fascinating how it tied together. So yes, they weren't able to withdraw this. So the award and interest payments. So on January 22nd, 1926, the Pecuniary Claims Tribunal awarded the Cayuga Nation $100,000 from the United States. The Department of Indian Affairs decided to preserve the capital distribution of interest annually as annuity payments. So on January 25th, 1828, interest payments were calculated for the period June 9th, 1888 to March 31st, 1928. $22,078.20 payments for 1888 and 1894 legal services, travel for witnesses. So they did a lot of accounting from this as well too. And they said that if the Cayuga, if they use the award to pay off all the expenses for this, because they actually use some Six Nations Trust Fund money, they would only get left with like 40% of their money. But so they had to put it through an act of parliament, and they had to do a vote on parliament to cover the cost of all this money and restore the funds to the Six Nations Trust Fund. So they actually do go through that work, and so the Canadian government does cover the cost and does return the funds back to the money. So it's an interesting story, but we have all the documents here that kind of relate to that. And the other thing that is in this too, so we do find out what happens to that treaty and document. So they strike a deal. Duncan Campbell Scott strikes a deal with one of the heirs, this Elizabeth Davis, and she's currently a nurse in New York at that time, and she has this treaty. She has the treaty medal, and they track her down through all the records, and then eventually you find a receipt that they offered to pay her $1,000 for the treaty. Where do they get that $1,000? They get that $1,000 from the Cayuga award money to pay for it. So they use their own money to pay for that treaty. So that's what happens with that. And so eventually they get the treaty and medal from her. So that's what's used in that Pecuniary Claims Court. So that was really strong evidence. And I'll tell you, if you actually look at that treaty itself, right at the top corner, you'll see it says Bissel Commission. So that's how I can confirm. I think, yeah, I'll show you in a second. So the annuity payment is just a 5% annuity. So this is what we get paid today. Is like it draws from that 5%. Probably every other year because there's not enough money anymore. So that's what gets paid for annuities. It's like, that's the 5%. And so the annuity account is called, so it's deposited in a special account. It's called the Cayuga Indians Annuity Fund. So capital must not be expended. Interest rate is fixed at 5%, distributed annually. So that was that during that time. Yeah, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself. It's just a lot of information there. And so let's go back to this one real quick. So lasting questions and some things that kind of stuck out after all this stuff. So we kind of learned where the money comes from, how they got the money. And these are considerations I think that we could further explore. So the treaty and medal, for example, are retained by Library and Archives Canada. So that's these two things here. Oh, I can't go back there. So right at the top corner, if you see it, there says Bissel Commission on there. And so these are the two medals. And this is the medal. So Library and Archives Canada do have confirmed with me that they do have this treaty and this medal. And it's still sitting there to this day. They don't have a repatriation policy, but they're interested in working out one. If we were to get this brought back to the community as a temporary loan, it costs us $100,000. I've already looked at the form of if we were to get it back for the centennial of 1929, which was the very first payment, it would cost us roughly around 100,000 just to bring it down here. And that's being like all the preparation looked after. I often think that we could probably make a case for getting these items back because we have a lot of documentation paperwork for it. And then the Cayuga Nation exists today and is appropriated by the Paternalistic Indian Affairs Department. So they had control over the funds. So that's another thing that I'm kind of highlighting here is like, whoever the Cayuga Nation is today that could be recognized to get this fund, can this fund be reinvested? Can it be added to? Like, can our interest payments be re-added to it? Like, can we have control over this? Because it still feels very paternalistic, and it seems like even this year it wasn't without some issue about distributing these funds. So it makes me wonder, like, can we not get control of these funds ourselves and reinvest this and get more money into there so the interest distributions can be more? Because the payment itself of $4 or $5 is a Canadian law and not anything to do with a treaty. They're just there to handle the payments. So one of the lasting things as well too is that our chiefs did try to go to Washington to try to re-deal with this, but they were shut down. The New York governor at the time said that the matter was considered closed after this. Like their money was paid, all obligations are completed after this. So you can't go after New York State today because to them their matter is closed because of this binding agreement that was made in 1927, which our chiefs tried to withdraw from but were denied. So here's another little thing too, before we kind of end here. So David Jameson was somebody that's writing from this community here, was writing to the technical advisor James White in 1927. So he kind of expresses some concern for lack of follow-up to Cayuga claim, requests clarity on whether the Canadian government will distribute the awarded benefits to the Canadian Cayugas, anticipates difficulties in verifying Cayuga identity, especially among enfranchised individuals. So you have enfranchisement, but also you have people marrying. So underneath the Indian Act at that time, if you were Cayuga, you were a Cayuga woman and you married a Mohawk man, you became a Mohawk man, or Mohawk. You didn't become a Mohawk man, you became a Mohawk Nation. So they would take that, and that's where you'd fall underneath that band list. So if you were to get, like, for example, if you were thinking you married the Mohawk man and you're getting this award, it's funny, you're not going to get paid. Even though you're maternally a Cayuga, they're going by the Indian Act. So some more other things too. So keep in mind, we get some interesting ideas too. So they hope that anticipates of verifying Cayuga identity, especially among the enfranchised individuals, hopes for a better process than the Oneida distribution, which was marred by lost records and lack of recourse. And of course, there was a lot of political tensions. There was increased presence of RCMP on the reserve, allegedly to increase loyalty. Warns there could be escalate into a situation similar to the Jake Ice episode at St. Regis, And that was like, what is this now? So I had to go dig into that and find that history. And it was Darren Bonaparte writes about that history. And it was these two brothers, Jake Ice and Jake Fire. And Jake Ice was, I think it was like a chief or something in their community. And like, he was very like a supporter of their rights and stuff like that. And he ends up getting shot in the back by RCMP. And it's like a huge, big thing over there. It's an interesting history. And that's something I didn't really see. And then I see it referenced here. And so the government actually takes that as kind of like a threat. So Jameson actually urges Premier King to visit Mackenzie King to visit Six Nations to explain Canada's new autonomy, which can override British guarantees, a move that could alienate traditional allies. And then Morgan writes that Scott provides character sketches of key community members such as David Jameson, Chancellor Carlo, Jake Johnson, and Dr. Tom Miller, Robert Hinnott. So not favorably. So agrees with Jameson though. The distribution will be difficult under both traditional and modern systems. And also describes the turmoil on the reserve, including old council members meeting at the Cayuga Longhouse, a planned protest by the Longhouse women during the White Dog ceremony, a strategy to restore the old council and help infrastructure projects like the roads and schools, and one of them makes the recommendation beginning work on hospitals, so Lady Valentin, 1927, and road projects to ease tensions. Advises against sending the confidential letters to official channels, and reports a bad harvest and growing poverty, worsening the situation on the reserve. So all these things are coming up, right? And so this annuity money, we say $5 today, but if you're poor in that during that time, and you had like 4 people in your family, you got $20. That's almost $1,400 today's time, or $1,300 today's money. You have all these issues going on, and now you got this windfall of money. You're doing that right. So it is like today we kind of scoff at the $5, but when they got it, it was really helpful. But again, like, it wasn't a full controversy. So that's why I wanted to put in your mind, and as the community's minds, Cayuga members' minds, there's these treaties and medals that are out there that we could probably get back into our community. All right, so that's the history that kind of ties into it. And that's why we get the money into $5. That's where it comes from. That's all the history that's kind of tied into it. And we're not done with this at all. So the next part is part 2. I'm not going to go through all this with everybody, but part 2 will be probably the next big thing that we'll present on. So it's currently documenting the collection. We have pay lists, Longhouse marriage licenses get mentioned, and community member names. So like a lot of claims and cases are in there. So a lot of community members. So if you're trying to do a genealogy, it may be useful for you to look in there because there is a lot of names in there. But that's pretty much what I have so far. I want to see if I have anything else for everybody, but that's kind of it. And I'm for sure believing I probably missed something here or there. And probably a lot of the cooler things are mentioned in the collection as well too. We do have a finding aid available, and it will make your life so much more easier. I don't think I can show you. Ryan, can I share the screen of my finding aid real quick or no? Okay, I'm gonna show you the finding aid real quick. Just to show you the fruits of our labors with this real quick. It's not really like anything like super special right at the moment, but it's getting there. Right. So this is what we're working on here. There we go. So here's the finding aid here. So as you can see, it's about 143 pages. And yeah, so you can see the entry there. And then the nice thing about this is that we can share it digitally, so we can send it to you in email. You can also just search for names, right? So that makes your life easier. And so you can see on there, but when you go scroll all the way down, we can see more in here. So there's summaries of most of the information that's on there. Names, Chief Isaac Davis. That's what I'm saying here. Yeah. So you can read the commission. So, okay, so if you're trying to say for example, you want to access something on here. So you'll just say like, you can even just copy and paste like the whole thing on here. Like this. You just copy and paste that. But you wanted the accession number, a title, and then that should be enough for you. Even if you just say you're requesting these 2 items here, that's good enough because we'll know what you're talking about there. As long as we can tell you that accession number, we can get you a document that you're interested in. But if you want to say, like, for example, the session in Buffalo, New York, 1889, here's a list of all the names that were present there. In Toronto, December 2nd and 13th, 1889, So again, we have a lot of names documented. So I want to show you really quick on the bottom. So we're working at right now, we're roughly like in the year 1931 or 32, 261. And then, yeah, we have way more names on it too. As you can see, there's more names on it. So again, this will be accessible center, but like we want to make it digital so you can just send the email request so you can read at home. And yeah, and that's what's taking so long, is to summarize each and every document that we're going through. And then just so you get an idea what's on there, but keep in mind there might be more information on there. You may leave a little bit here and up there. But the important things are there, like the names, the community names, and things like that. So it's been a huge body of work. You know, it's about 143 pages. You can skim through it, or you can read the whole thing, get a good idea of what's going on. And yeah, it's been really good to understand our history and where we're at this point. Again, we want to make this accessible. We're going to keep on going till we're done. But yeah, that's about as far as we go with that one, is a draw card from 1991. So wild stuff. And I would say I would encourage everybody in our community, like if you have material that's kind of related to this, you know, please feel free to share. Like, hang on, I think I can reshare. I got to share my last slide so you can get my contact information. Sorry, I just to share my last slide with y'all. So yeah, that's what I'll see you. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something today. For more questions, please send me an email at Taylor Gibson, taylor.gibson@snpolytechnic.com, or you can visit me at the center. You can come review the collection yourself. If you want a finding aid, you can, or you want a copy of the finding aid directly, I can just send it to you right now. Again, it's been really good work. I'm excited for this. I'm excited to finish up the distributions. And then finally, to start other projects as well too. So hopefully you learned something. You know, I'm very excited for this. And if you still didn't get enough, you can also look at my Facebook post as well. I'll give a shout out to my Facebook post because I posted a couple of these stories in there too. So you can see more of the documentation as we went along. All right, I see that we're at 12:36. I think we're exhausted our time. Anything else, Ryan? Or are we good? Excellent. Yeah, that's what I'll see you, everyone. Thank you all.